I found out my husband had put our house in his mother's name on a Tuesday afternoon in March. While I was sitting in the office of a divorce attorney I had not yet decided to hire. The attorney, a sharp, unhurried woman named Diane Foley, had asked me to pull up the county property records on her computer so we could look at the asset picture together. I typed in our address, I hit search, and the name that came back as the owner of the home I had lived in for 9 years, the home I had decorated and repainted and planted a garden behind, the home where I had given birth to my daughter in an emergency delivery when the hospital was 40 minutes away, and we did not make it in time. The name on that record was not mine. It was not my husband's. It was Eleanor Marsh, my mother-in-law. And the transfer date was 14 months earlier. 14 months. I had been living in that house, paying half the mortgage from my own income, hosting holidays, putting my daughter to bed in her room down the hall, for 14 months without knowing that the house did not belong to us anymore. And Diane Foley looked at that screen and then looked at me and said, very quietly, "Did you know about this?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Okay, then we have a lot of work to do." My name is Renata Serrano. I am 42 years old. I live in a house in Tucson, Arizona, a house that is mine, fully and legally and permanently mine. And I have a daughter named Izzy, who is 11 and who has her father's eyes and my stubbornness, and no idea how close she came to not having a home. I am a licensed occupational therapist. I have a life that is, by every measure that actually matters, exactly what I want it to be. But what I am about to tell you is the story of how I almost lost everything, not to a stranger, not to chance, not to some impersonal disaster, but to the man I married and the woman who raised him, and how, in the end, the truth they tried to hide became the exact thing that protected me. If you are new to the Revenge Diaries, welcome. This is a community for real stories told honestly: family, betrayal, consequences, and what comes after. Please subscribe and hit the like button before we go any further. And tell me where you are watching from. Drop your city in the comments. I love this community, and I love knowing where people are when they find these stories. Now, let me go back to the beginning, because nothing that happened in Diane Foley's office makes sense without understanding what came before it. I met my husband. His name was Griffin Marsh, and I use the past tense deliberately, not because he is gone, but because the version of him I married turned out to be something I no longer have access to at a work conference in Phoenix when I was 30. He was 32, handsome in a specific kind of way that grew on you rather than striking you immediately, working in project management for a construction firm. We talked for 3 hours over dinner and then for another hour in the hotel lobby after, and I drove home the next morning thinking that something had shifted. We dated for 2 years. We got engaged. We married in a ceremony in his parents' backyard in Scottsdale that Eleanor had organized with the thoroughness of a woman who understood that controlling the event meant controlling the framing of it. I did not see that at the time. I saw a mother who loved her son and wanted his wedding to be beautiful. I was very good in those early years at seeing the most generous possible interpretation of everything. Eleanor Marsh was a woman of absolute conviction. She believed, with a completeness that I came to find suffocating, that her son was the center of everything and that everything and everyone around him should organize itself accordingly. She was not overtly cruel. She did not say unkind things to my face. What she did was more subtle and, in many ways, more effective. She simply proceeded as if I were a guest in a family whose arrangements had been settled long before I arrived and would continue to be settled by her long after any particular conversation. She made decisions about Griffin's time, his holidays, his money, his mother's advice, without acknowledging that he now had a wife whose input was relevant. And Griffin, who had been raised inside Eleanor's orbit and had never successfully developed the specific gravity needed to maintain his own, orbited her in return. Not openly, not in ways that were easy to point to in the early years, but consistently, reliably, always. The house was my idea originally. We had been renting for the first 3 years of our marriage, and I was the one who started researching neighborhoods, who dragged Griffin to open houses, who built the spreadsheet that compared properties by school district and commute time and square footage and price. I was the one who found the house on Mesa Verde Drive with the mature cottonwood in the backyard, and the kitchen that needed work but had the bones of something wonderful. I was the one who called the lender and started the pre-approval process. Griffin came to the final walkthrough and said, "Yeah, it's good," and the way he said most things, present but not quite there, as if he were watching something rather than participating in it, We bought it. My name was on the deed. His name was on the deed. Our names were on the mortgage together, which I was paying approximately 60% of because Griffin's income had been inconsistent that year due to a job change. Eleanor did not like the house. Not the house specifically. I think she would not have liked any house I chose because the choosing had been mine. She visited twice in the first year and both times found structural concerns, layout problems, things she was surprised we had not noticed before buying. I replastered the kitchen walls. I installed the backsplash myself over 2 weekends. I planted the garden in the back and built the raised beds from reclaimed wood I had sourced from a salvage place east of the city. I made it beautiful. And Eleanor, to her credit, eventually stopped mentioning its original flaws, which I understood to mean that she could no longer credibly pretend they were still there. Izzy was born 3 years after we moved in. The delivery was the most frightening experience of my life and also the most clarifying. 40 minutes from the nearest hospital when my labor accelerated beyond anything we had planned for. Griffin driving and white-knuckled. Me in the back seat doing the one thing I had trained for years to help other people do, which was breathe through something that felt impossible. We made it. Izzy was fine. I was fine. And for a period after that, the first year of her life, the sleepless and consuming and occasionally transcendent year of early parenthood, things between Griffin and me reached something closer to genuine partnership than they had been before. A shared project has a way of focusing things. Parenthood, when it works at all, is the most focused project there is. But something had been shifting underneath the surface for longer than I had admitted. Griffin's relationship with Eleanor had never receded the way I had expected it to after we married. He called her daily, not a quick check-in, but long calls, 20 and 30 minutes. While I was putting Izzy to bed or making dinner or handling the administrative machinery of our household that seemed increasingly to run primarily on my effort, he deferred to her opinions on things that were not her business. He made financial decisions, small ones at first, then larger ones, based on conversations he had with her rather than with me. And when I raised this, which I did carefully and then less carefully as the years passed, he became defensive in the specific way of a person who knows they cannot defend the behavior but cannot stop it either. The first real warning sign, the one I can see clearly now as the beginning of what would eventually end everything, came about 4 years into living in the house. Griffin mentioned, casually, that he had been thinking about having his mother's name added to some of our documents. For estate planning purposes, he said, in case something happened to us and she needed to act quickly on Izzy's behalf. I said I thought we should talk to an estate attorney if we were thinking about any of that, and that any arrangement involving assets should involve both of us fully and formally and with proper legal guidance. He said, of course, in the way he said things he had no intention of doing. And I noted it, and I moved on, and I did not think about it again for a long time. I should have thought about it again. I know that now. But here's the thing about living inside a slow-moving situation. The slowness is the point. Each individual moment is too small to act on. The accumulation is what becomes undeniable. And by the time the accumulation becomes clear, a great deal has already happened. Griffin lost his job again in what I later understood to be the beginning of the end of that marriage in any real sense. Not the paperwork end, that came later. The real end, the end where the person you marry becomes someone you are managing rather than partnering with, came when he lost the job and did not tell me for 3 weeks. He left the house at the same time every morning. He came home at the same time every evening. He continued as if nothing had changed. And during those 3 weeks, I found out later, he had been spending his days at Eleanor's house in Scottsdale, sitting in her kitchen, being managed and advised and consoled in the way she had always preferred to manage and advise and console him. And it was during those 3 weeks, I believe, that the conversation about the house happened. I cannot prove the specific timing, but I know my mother-in-law. And I know that crisis for Eleanor was always an opportunity to solidify arrangements. I found the tax document by accident. It came in a pile of mail I was sorting one evening while Griffin was putting Izzy to bed. And it was addressed to Eleanor Marsh at our address, which was wrong. She lived in Scottsdale, and it was a property tax notice for Miss Averd Drive. I looked at it for a long moment. I set it aside. I did not bring it up that night because something in the specific oddness of it made me want to understand it before I spoke. I called Diane Foley the next morning. Her name had been given to me by a colleague who had been through a difficult divorce herself and who had said, "If you ever need someone who actually pays attention, call Diane." I had not known why I was calling her. I told myself it was just to ask a question. And then I was sitting in her office looking at the county records, and there was Eleanor's name on my house, and 14 months had passed since the transfer, and I had not known any of it. I want to stop here and ask you something because this is the moment in the story where everything changes. You have just found out that your house, the home where you live, where your child sleeps, where you have built your life, has been transferred out of your name without your knowledge or consent. What do you do next? Do you go home and confront your husband immediately? Do you call a lawyer? Do you call someone who loves you and tell them what you are looking at? Do you stay very quiet and start paying very close attention? I want to know what you would do. Drop it in the comments right now, because the way I handled the next 72 hours was the thing that made the difference between this story ending well and this story ending the way Griffin and Eleanor expected it to end. I stayed quiet, not because I was not furious. I was furious in a way that had a physical presence, a weight that sat on my chest the whole drive home. But because Diane had said, before I left her office, "Do not go home and confront him yet. Go home, act normal, and come back tomorrow with every financial document you can access." Because once he knows you know, things will start to move. And I trusted Diane fully in the immediate, specific way you trust someone who is clearly smarter than you about the thing you need help with. So I went home. I made dinner. I helped Izzy with her homework. I watched Griffin eat the dinner I made and talk about something that had happened in his day. He had a new part-time consulting arrangement by then, and I said the right things, and I asked the right questions, and I collected every document I could quietly access that evening. Bank statements, tax returns, the mortgage paperwork from when we bought the house, our marriage certificate, Izzy's birth certificate, insurance documents. I took photographs of everything with my phone, and I sent them to an email account I had created that afternoon specifically for this purpose. I went back to Diane the next morning. She had, in the intervening 24 hours, done her own research, and what she had found was this. The property transfer had been executed using a quitclaim deed. A quitclaim deed, Diane explained, is a legal instrument that transfers whatever ownership interest the grantor has to the recipient. In this case, Griffin had used a quitclaim deed to transfer his half of the ownership interest in the house to Eleanor. My name, because the house was jointly owned and because a quitclaim deed only transfers the signing party's interest, was still technically on the deed. But Eleanor now owned half the house. Half of the house I had found, bought, improved, and lived in for 9 years now belonged to my mother-in-law. And the specific way it had been done, without my knowledge, without a conversation, using an instrument that Griffin had clearly been advised on, told me everything I needed to know about what had been planned and what the end goal was. Diane said there were several possible legal paths. She said the transfer itself was not necessarily void. A person can transfer their own ownership interest, but that it had implications for the mortgage, implications for our marital property situation, and potentially implications around financial disclosure obligations within the marriage, depending on how the courts viewed it. She said, "The most important thing right now is that you have documentation of your financial contributions to this property. Do you have records of your mortgage payments?" I said I had 9 years of bank statements. She said, "Good, then let's get to work." I told Griffin that evening. I waited until Izzy was in bed, and then I sat down across from him at the kitchen table, our kitchen table. In the kitchen I had rattled with my own hands, and I said, "I need to ask you about a property tax notice I received." And I watched the color change in his face in a way that told me, before he said a single word, that he had been waiting for this conversation and had hoped it would not come. He said, "Renata," I said, "when did you transfer your share of this house to your mother?" He said, "It was a planning thing." "It was temporary." I said, "When?" He said, "About 14 months ago." I said, "Without telling me?" Not a question, a statement. He said, "I was going to tell you." And I said, "Griffin, you were going to tell me." And I stood up from the table and I went to our bedroom and I locked the door and I did not cry. I had decided I was not going to cry until this was finished. I had things to do first. The divorce filing happened 3 weeks later. Eleanor, when she found out that I had retained Diane Foley and that Diane had already filed the initial paperwork, responded by doing what Eleanor always did when she felt her arrangements being disrupted. She became very busy. She called Griffin multiple times a day. She contacted a property attorney of her own. She sent a formal letter through her attorney asserting her ownership interest in the Miss Averd Drive property and requesting that I vacate within 30 days. 30 days. From the home I had lived in for 9 years, from the home where my daughter slept, from the home I had paid 60% of the mortgage on for most of those 9 years. Diane read that letter and set it down on her desk and said, "She has made a tactical error." I asked what she meant. She said, "She has put her position in writing. Now we can respond to it." What followed was a process I will describe in the honest, general terms it deserves, because the specifics belong to the legal record and to my attorney and not to a YouTube video, and because what mattered was not the procedural detail, but the principle underneath it. The principle was this: I had contributed financially, consistently, and documentably to the acquisition and improvement of that property. My name had been on the original deed. The transfer of Griffin's interest to Eleanor had not eliminated my interest. And the marital estate, the question of what had been built during our marriage and how it should be equitably distributed, was a matter for the divorce court, not for a quitclaim deed that had been executed without my knowledge during what appeared to be a deliberate attempt to move assets ahead of an anticipated divorce proceeding. Diane argued this clearly and completely. The court was not sympathetic to Eleanor's position. The judge, a careful and specific woman who I remember as the kind of person who has heard everything and is not fooled by any of it, asked pointed questions about the timing of the transfer, the absence of disclosure to a spouse, and the relationship between the transferor and the recipient. Eleanor's attorney made the argument they had clearly prepared. It did not land the way they had hoped. The outcome, after several months of process, was that the property was treated as part of the marital estate, that Eleanor's claimed interest was determined not to supersede the marital property framework, and that in the division of assets I received the house. The house. The one I had found and chosen and planted a garden behind and brought my daughter home to from the hospital, where she had barely been born in time. I received it, outright, in my name alone. I want to tell you about the day I got the final order. Diane called me on a Wednesday afternoon, and I was in my car outside the grocery store, and I answered, and she said, "It's done, Renata. The house is yours." And I sat in that parking lot for 10 minutes before I went inside. Not crying. I had cried by then. Plenty, in the months of the process, in the evenings after Izzy was in bed, in the precise and private way of someone who understands that grief and relief exist in the same room, and that it is okay to feel both at once. What I felt in that parking lot was something quieter than either, something closer to solidity. A floor finally confirmed as the floor. Izzy, who is 11 now and sharper than either of her parents gave her credit for, asked me once about 6 months after we had settled into life on Miss Averd Drive without Griffin. He had moved into an apartment across town, and the arrangement for her time between us was civil and functional, if not warm. She asked, "Mom, did Grandma Eleanor try to take our house?" I looked at her for a moment. I thought about what to say. And I said, "Something happened with the house that needed to get fixed." And it got fixed. And we live here, and this is our home. She looked at me with her father's eyes and my stubbornness, and she said, "Okay." And then she went back to her homework. And I thought, not for the first time, that children understand more than we give them credit for and forgive more gracefully than we deserve. My relationship with Griffin is managed and civil and directed primarily toward Izzy's well-being, which is exactly what it should be. I do not hate him. I spent some time there in the early months, and it was exhausting and it accomplished nothing. What I have arrived at is something more accurate and more useful than hate. A clear understanding of who he is and what he needed and what he was unable to provide, and the specific peace that comes from no longer expecting something from a person that they are not built to give. He is a good father to Izzy in the ways he is capable of. That matters. I have decided to let that be enough. Eleanor, I do not see. We have no reason to interact, and neither of us has sought one. I understand that she believed, with her whole heart, that what she was doing was protecting her son. I understand that the love she had for Griffin was real, even when the methods it produced were not. But understanding why someone did something is not the same as being willing to share your life with the aftermath of it. I have chosen not to. That is not a wound. It is a boundary. And there is a difference between those two things that took me a long time to understand, and that I now believe is one of the most important distinctions available to a person trying to build a life that is actually their own. The garden behind the house is the most beautiful it has ever been. I added 2 more raised beds last spring. Izzy has claimed one of them and grows tomatoes with a level of attention that I find both amusing and deeply familiar. We eat dinner outside most evenings when the weather allows, which in Tucson is most of the year. I sit at the table I bought secondhand and refinished myself. In the yard I built with reclaimed wood. Behind the house with my name on the deed, and I think about what it cost to get here and whether I would do it differently if I could. And the honest answer is that I would have been more careful earlier, more attentive to the things that were easy to dismiss, more willing to name the slow-moving things before they moved too far. But I would not trade where I am for where I was. Not for anything. Here's what I want you to take away from this. If you're in a partnership right now, a marriage, a domestic partnership, any shared life where assets and finances are involved, know what your name is on. Not vaguely, not approximately. Know specifically, currently, exactly what you own and what you do not. Not because you expect the person you love to do what Griffin did, but because knowing what you own is not paranoia. It is self-respect. It is the specific act of taking your own life seriously enough to understand its material reality. And because the gap between what you believe you own and what the records say you own is exactly the gap that people who mean to take things from you will move through if you give them the opportunity. Know what you own. Keep your own records. Have your own attorney you can call, not because love is not real, but because love and legal reality are two different things. And the most loving thing you can do for the people who depend on you, including your children, including your future self, is to make sure those two things are aligned. I will see you in the next one. And before you go, what would you have done in Diane Foley's office when you saw Eleanor's name on your house? Would you have gone home and confronted your husband that night? Would you have stayed quiet and gathered documents the way I did? Drop it in the comments. This community's answers to questions like that are some of the most honest and thoughtful things I ever read. Subscribe to the Revenge Diaries if you are not already here. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and thank you for being here. Every story in this community exists because someone was willing to tell the truth about something hard. This one is mine. I hope it gives you something worth keeping.